started because there were people in this room loading equipment. And so I didn't have time to troubleshoot, and we had some troubleshooting to do. Namely, we don't have access to this projector. Yeah. Hey, Christian. Were they big fish? No, no big fish today.
so much for being here and making it out to my DMA lecture recital. For those of you in person, I'm very grateful for you guys making the trip, and those attending virtually via the live stream as well. So the purpose of this concert is to be able to display the research that I've been doing for my dissertation project as part of my degree requirements for the DMA. So up here on the presentation, this is the title of my dissertation actually, and it is the Scholastic Trombone Ensemble. It's an instructional guide and custom arrangements for secondary school trombone ensemble. So with this, I want to show a project overview first. So we're going to talk a little bit about the history of the trombone choir. We're going to talk about ensemble setup, and then overall arrangement guidelines and methodology. So a big part of this project was actually making these arrangements targeted towards these secondary school students. So I couldn't go way off the deep end and do all this crazy, extravagant stuff, but we can still find a lot of educational value, and that's the purpose of the project. So quickly, a brief history of the trombone choir. You know, if we actually want to go way back to the Renaissance, we didn't quite have homogeneous trombone ensembles yet, but we had these groups called alto bands, right? And alto bands were generally made up of shawms and sackbuts and any combination of the two. Now, as we move forward through history, the trombone ensemble doesn't get a whole lot of love until about the mid-18th century. There was a group of Christians known as the Moravians, and the Moravians would use trombone ensembles with all of their church services, whether it be funerals or births or weddings or just a normal Sunday, rain or shine, snow or sleet, that trombone choir was there. And in fact, they were originally from a modern-day Czech Republic and immigrated to the United States in the mid-18th century, located and targeted more around Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, before making their way down south around the East Coast. Now, while that was, you know, a very strong trombone ensemble and a great example of a homogeneous trombone ensemble, the academic trombone ensemble doesn't really come into the picture until the founding of the Eastman Trombone Choir in 1941. So one of the most famous and popular pedagogues that we reference in trombone pedagogy and even brass pedagogy is Emory Remington, who is the figure right here. And so he established this as basically a lab to extend what students would learn in lessons and be able to, you know, start using these skill sets in homogeneous setting. So now we can get to the arrangement guidelines and methodology. Here's what the Moravians would look like. As you can see, they have all types of different trombones: soprano, alto, tenor, and even bass trombone. So I actually found another dissertation by Dr. Gregory Freeman, who is a trombone performance and educator over in the DC area. His specialization is middle school and high school trombone ensembles. And so through his dissertation, he briefly outlines, you know, what would be a good idea and what might not be such a good idea when catering to these groups. So I have these different points with clef, range, number of parts, etc. So just very briefly, we're going to stick to the bass clef in this project. As trombone players, you know, learning trombone repertoire, eventually they will be introduced to tenor clef, alto clef, and even treble clef. But for the purpose of this project, and so that we can focus on other academic virtues, we're going to stick with bass clef. Now, the range for the trombone, you know, range for trombone can vary widely from player to player. And so whenever we're trying to set a guideline for a massive number of players, it's good just to kind of stick within even parameters. So I have 7th position E2, which is our second partial E, all the way up to B flat 4, which would be our 8th partial B flat. Next up, we have the number of parts. Now, I was making this project trying to cater to all types of different middle school and high school ensembles, and just by the nature of that, there'll be some ensembles that have 16 trombone players, and that's just wonderful. There'll be some programs that are barely able to get to 4. And so through this project, a lot of the arrangements are actually for 4 parts, but there are some for 5, 6, 7, and then even up to a trombone octet. Next up, complex meter and rhythms. Generally, you know, unless we're wanting to use the meter as an educational entry point, trying to keep it more simple, at least duple meter. We do eventually get into some compound meter in this project. And rhythms, just not overly complicated rhythms, just for ease of reading. And then tempo, this one was kind of funny to me. In his document, Dr. Gregory Freeman mentions that the tempo should not be so fast to compromise technique, but not so slow as to lose the attention of the ensemble players. So I tried to make sure we found a happy middle ground there. And then with articulation, in general, we are staying away from multiple tonguing, whether it be double tonguing, or triple tonguing, right? We're going to stay away from that, as that requires musculature development with the tongue, as the tongue is a muscle, and a lot of these students will not have had experience doing that yet. And then finally, Dr. Gregory Freeman mentions melodic distribution. Now, with melodic distribution, in this project, it wasn't easy to maintain the same parameters, but in general, I tried to make sure that most parts had an opportunity to play the melody, and that no one part was playing the melody for an extended period of time. The only exception to that rule is peasant song, and we'll cross that bridge when we get there. All right, so the piece that you just heard, that was Imperial Fanfare. Now, with this project, I decided I wanted to have a kind of timeline of Western music, and going all the way from the Middle Ages all the way to around the 1950s. However, I decided to start with the classical era simply because I thought that was a great concert opener. It's a fanfare, right? And so the composer was Antonio Salieri. He was born 1750, died 1825. He was an Italian classical composer, but he actually did the bulk of his career in Vienna, Austria, working for the Habsburg monarchy. So he was the court composer and Kapellmeister there, meaning that he wrote tons and tons of music. This was during the time that the patronage system was still in full swing, and so composers would make a living basically being housed with these aristocrats, and they would write music for them on the regular. So the next step of this project, I like to talk about the composer, historical context, all of that, and then I'd really like to talk about the justification. Why did I add this piece to the course of study? Well, this actually is the only piece within this project that was originally written for brass. And so we can then talk about a more classical approach to brass articulation. Even though there were pretty loud volumes in that particular piece, at no point was it really brassy or tongued very, very hard. And so we had that classical approach. This piece was actually popularized in the Art of Trumpet Vienna album, and originally was performed by 3 trumpets and a timpani. Now, you might notice we didn't have a timpani out here. So I actually, in the adaptations, I replaced the timpani with bass trombone, and then I also transposed the original key, which was E flat major, down to B flat major. The reason I did that is, trying to make this piece accessible for middle school and high school trombone students. B flat major matches the harmonic overtone series of the trombone, which means that essentially, a lot of the time, B flat is the first note that a lot of young trombone players learn, and the key of B flat is one of the first keys that they learn. So we don't have to worry about them not being able to recognize that. We can focus on other educational values. All right. So the next piece that you're going to hear is, we're going to go back in time to the Middle Ages. This piece is called Mundus Vergens, and it's actually by an anonymous composer. Some people theorize that it was written by Periton, and I'll explain why here in a moment. But first, it's worth noting that this was found in the Magnus Liber Organi, which just stands for the Great Book of Organum, originally compiled by Leonin, who actually pioneered 2-voice organum, which is the earliest form of polyphonic writing. And so, while this is in the Great Book of Organum, it's worth noting that it actually isn't an organum, it's a conductus. I mentioned that organum is a polyphonic textured genre. This piece that you're about to hear is more homophonic in nature. Conductus can be either secular or non-secular, which just means religious or non-religious. I can flip those around. This one is somewhere in the middle. It talks about the world ending, and it does bring in some religious ties. So, what was the justification for adding this? Well, this was originally meant to be sung by a vocal ensemble, a 4-piece vocal ensemble specifically. And so then we can start talking about a vocal approach to articulation and tone color. And so I think that's very important as trombone players. A lot of our repertoire comes from vocal music originally. And this is also interesting because it's an entry point to modal harmonic language. Now, nowadays we think about a more tonal harmonic language, and all that really implies is that we have this sort of gravitational pull to certain tonal centers, right? With this, you're not going to feel that same type of pull. It's a different harmonic language in general. But that's another great entry point that we can talk about with students. And then also, this is in 12/8 meter. This is the only piece in the project that's in compound meter. So what you see here on the right side, this is minstrel notation. This is what the piece would have originally looked like when written in around the 1300s. Now, I transcribed the rhythmic interpretation from the Hilliard Ensemble's Puritan and the Ars Antiqua album. And reason being is this notation that you see here, this pneumatic notation, it didn't have a solidified rhythmic interpretation quite yet. And so whenever you hear different recordings of this piece, you'll hear different rhythmic interpretations as well. Other adaptations that I made was voice swapping when necessary to try to keep it so part 1 is the highest part 2 is the second highest, etc. And so I did some voice swapping in order to make that happen. But otherwise, without further ado, here is Mundus Versions. So that was our Middle Ages entry, Mundus Versions, as I mentioned before. It was a conductus potentially by Puritan, but not 100%. So next up, we have our Renaissance entry. And another part of this project that I haven't quite mentioned yet that I'm trying to do is showcase not only different eras throughout Western music, but also different regions. So that first piece that you heard, that would have been from Paris, France, specifically within the Notre Dame School of Music, which we would still have your Leonin, Puritan, and contemporaries of them. And so this next piece is actually by an Italian composer, but it's really interesting. He tries to write it in a French style, which we'll get into in a moment. But the composer's name is Giovanni Cavaccio. He was born in 1556, died in 1626. So we're thinking, more late Renaissance with this one. He's originally from Bergamo, Italy. He lived and studied and performed in Munich, Venice, and Rome before finally returning back to his hometown of Bergamo, where he became the maestro of the cathedral. That was where he finished up his career. Now, Cavaccio, he wrote a bunch of different music, both non-secular and secular. In fact, in this collection that was titled Music Containing Two Fantasias, which served as the beginning and end of the work, French-style canzonas, a pavane with saltereo, madrigals, and a proverb for 4 voices. That's a mouthful, right? Really inventive guy with the title there. But actually, the canzonas, which you're about to hear, one of them, were originally written in a French style. Throughout music history, we see different periods have nationalistic approaches to music. So we have a national identity. For example, if you hear an Italian composition, it's going to sound different than a French composition. That's going to sound different to a German composition. Well, Caravaggio is one of those composers during this time frame that actually tried to merge nationalistic ideas and genres. So that's an example of that. So why did I include this piece, La Brigantia, into the project? Well, this is a really crazy introduction to polyphonic writing. As I mentioned before, the piece that you heard was more homophonic just previously. And so you're going to hear all these types of staggered entrances. You're going to hear all these rhythms that are clashing. It's basically like the precursor to what would eventually become the fugue, right? And so think about that type of counterpoint, but just in a more modal harmonic language since we're in the Renaissance. This really, really tests and trains the skill of syncopation, right? Syncopation being weight outside of the beat. And so you'll hear up here, there will be quite a lot of syncopation. And this is actually an introduction to 4/2 meter. So for those of you who aren't necessarily musicians, aren't familiar with what meter is, basically the 4 tells you how many beats are in the measure, and the 2 tells you what gets the beat. So there are actually 4 half notes in a measure, which looks like double the length of more common time music that we see commonly. So the only real adaptation that I had to make to this piece, I didn't have to do a ton of voice changing. I transposed the key center from G mixolydian down to F mixolydian. So originally, G mixolydian would have shown a key signature that looks like C major, whereas F mixolydian changes that to B flat major. Remember what I said earlier about B flat and matching the harmonic overtone series of the instrument? So since this is polyphonic writing and 4/2 meter with tons of syncopation, I did not want to add the extra challenge of playing it in a key that's a little bit less comfortable. It is very important, however, that trombonists, even at the secondary school level, learn to play in all keys, but I think that that can be better served in another arrangement. And so now that we have the piece in F mixolydian, we have F as the new finalis, which is sort of like the modal term for tonic or key center. So without further ado, here's La Brigantia. So that was our Renaissance entry. And so next, I'm kind of cheating a little bit. This is going to be our Baroque entry, but you might notice between Orlando Gibbons, who was born 1583 and died in 1625, if we compare that to Giovanni Boccaccio, like, this looks pretty similar. Well, again, another point of this project that I mentioned before is to not only show different eras of music, but also show geographically what different musical identities were. And so while this is technically a very early Baroque piece, you're going to hear a mix as it's a kind of a transition between the Renaissance style and the Baroque style. So Orlando Gibbons, who I've already mentioned the birth and death dates, was a composer from Oxford, England. And as I kind of mentioned, he serves as the bridge between the Renaissance and the Baroque era in England. Kind of similar to how Beethoven is considered to act as the bridge between like the classical and the romantic eras in his writing. So this piece, The Silver Swan, was actually a madrigal found in his first set of madrigals and motets in 5 parts. Now, this is worth noting because before this, and speaking of like the Italian madrigal and the early English madrigal, it wouldn't have been in 5 parts, it would have been in 4 parts. So Orlando Gibbons adds the 5th part known as the quintus and makes it into 5 parts, and that's why you have 5 trombone players up here. Now this set of madrigals and motets, as the name implies for those of you who have taken music history in the past, it's going to be both secular and non-secular music. Madrigals being secular in nature and motets being more religious in nature. So what's the justification for this? This is yet another vocal entry into our repertoire. And it, again, showcases the transition from one period to another. Now, with the vocal approach to articulation, I didn't go as in-depth in Mundus Versions, but this one, it's really fascinating. I found some great research discussing the different consonants and the way that different consonants are formed and how we can use that to help influence our trombone articulation. So I have here, and you'll be like, what do these words mean? Most words in this composition begin with fricative consonants. So fricative consonants are consonants that basically create some sort of sizzle where the air never stops, it just gets caught. So like the letter S, everybody say S, S. And if you say like a TH, that's another fricative. So the silver swan has 3 out of 4 of the consonants are fricative. All right, and we can actually see that. Go back. If we look at the lyrics, the silver swan who living had no note, when death approached, unlocked her silent throat, leaning her breast against the reedy shore, thus sung her first and last, and sung no more. Farewell, all joys, O death, come close mine eyes. More geese than swans now live, more fools than wise. And so, while there are plosive consonants in this composition, and plosive consonants are the ones where you stop the air and then the air kind of pops behind it. So, like, if you say the letter, say b or p or t, things like that, duh, very common brass articulations, those are actually plosive consonants. And so we actually want to try to stay away from the more plosive consonants and think about the more fricative consonants where the air never actually stops. Okay. Now, some other adaptations that I did within this piece, I did have to do some part swapping when necessary, just due to the nature of how madrigals were written back in the day. They didn't necessarily go from the highest voice to the lowest voice, and so I did some part swapping to make sure that the trombone ensemble stuck to that nature. So without further ado, here is the Silver Swan. so that again was our Renaissance entry. So the next step, or excuse me, that was our Baroque entry. The next step would be a stop by the Classical era. We already did that at the beginning, so we're skipping that. We're back into the Romantic era. Specifically, this piece is called A Peasant Song, and it's a lyric piece by Edvard Grieg. Edvard Grieg, who was born in 1843 and died in 1907, is known as one of, if not the most influential Norwegian composers to ever live. And so again, with one of the priorities of the project being to check out different regions, Norway being a very underrepresented region in music, I thought that Edvard Grieg would be terrific for it. So his compositional output was actually quite vast, writing all types of chamber music, symphonic music, lyric pieces, incidental music, you name it. He wrote all kinds of stuff. But he was actually originally a pianist, a piano player. And so this particular piece is the second lyric piece from his eighth book of lyric pieces, his Opus 65. And again, it's titled Peasant Song. And these were all lyric pieces that had to do with some sort of folk nature, right? Even though he's a more romantic composer and does have that more romantic harmonic style, he's definitely more folksy with it. So I thought that this was a fantastic introduction to the Romantic language, because with younger students, if you hand them something that is so dissonant that they just don't understand it, they're not going to be as interested. So this is really kind of dipping our toe into the water with some of that Romantic dissonance. So the adaptations that I made, again, this was originally written for piano, and so you have one pianist that has full autonomy over phrasing and dynamics and everything, and I don't see one piano up here, right? I see 6 trombone players. So I extended the original piano part to the 6 trombone parts, and then I actually transposed it from A major to A flat major. So if you see right here on the left, that originally was the piano part in A major, and on the right you can see that's A flat major. Okay? And then otherwise, I mentioned before that, you know, with 6 trombone players, it's not like one person having this sort of unified phrasing idea. So in order to unify it, I added some dynamics and then let them to take their own creative decision making there. So without further ado, this is Peasant Song. So that was our Romantic entry into the project. So now we finally get to the 20th century, right? And the piece that I have for you today is actually really, really fun and interesting. This piece is titled Dangerous Blues. And contrary to what the name might suggest, it's not fully blues, right? We're not to that point in history yet. This piece was written by Billy Brown, who was born in 1894 and died in 1921. And interestingly enough, her name wasn't actually Billy Brown when she was born. Her name was Irene Anderson. She had some family struggles in her childhood, to the extent it's not quite clear because there really isn't a lot of biographical information available about Willie Brown. But we know that she was eventually adopted by a man named William Brown, and she ended up taking his last name and renaming her first name. She unfortunately died at a very young age, the age of 27, due to the smallpox epidemic. But before then, she was already making a name for herself as a leading female composer of the late 1910s and early 1920s. So the genre for this piece is a foxtrot. And this is really, really fun because a foxtrot is not quite swung, but not quite not swung either, right? So it's kind of a happy middle ground and a pre-swing era introduction to what would eventually become swing. Now, the foxtrot wasn't originally a musical genre. It was originally a dance genre. The dance would look very similar to a ballroom dance like the waltz, but instead of being in triple meter, it's in duple meter. And so this particular version could be in cut time or it could be in 4/4 meter. This originally would have been danced to ragtime, the foxtrot in general, and that's why the foxtrot as a genre, whenever it becomes a musical genre, takes a lot of the rhythmic implications from ragtime and the type of syncopation from ragtime, and we transfer it to this format. So what's the justification for adding this piece to the program? Again, this is pre-era, or pre-swing era, pseudo-swing, right? The notation actually looks like dotted 8/16 notes, but they're not played like dotted 8/16 notes. You'll hear what I'm talking about when we play it. It does contain elements of the blues, specifically the alteration between the major and the minor third, but overall it doesn't really have much more than that. And then adaptations. So this piece would have been originally written for piano to be accompanied, or a piano accompanying a vocalist, right? Later it was reorchestrated, and a lot of the old big band groups would play this, and they expanded the part there. So we did something similar, except instead of a big band, we have trombone players. In this, I did try to pass the vocal melody through different parts, whether that be in the intro or at the bridge or wherever. I tried to make sure that the vocal melody was displayed through all the different parts. And then I did change octaves when necessary to keep it more idiomatic for the trombone. Again, that's something I had to do a couple times in this project because the range of the piano idiomatically is much larger than the range of the trombone. But yes, so without further ado, this is Dangerous Blues. And I also will actually be playing now. Decided I wanted to play a little bit on my own lecture recital. So it's worth noting that these compositions can be played without a conductor, but considering that they are intended for secondary school groups, a conductor is recommended. But if you have an advanced group, I'd highly recommend trying to build those chamber skill sets without having to use a conductor. talking about it, I just want to give a quick thank you to everybody who's here on stage. Most of these students, for either just for a couple weeks or even for an entire semester, have studied with me before, and I'm just so grateful to get to share the stage with them for the last time here at the University of Memphis. So yes, huge thank you to you guys for taking your time out of this busy part of the semester and playing some trombone with me. So can we give them a quick shout out? So the final piece within the concert, this piece was actually written in the 1940s by a Polish composer by the name of Grażyna Baczewicz. All right, she was one of the most prominent female Polish composers ever to live. There was another whose name is eluding me right now, but she was alive in the 1800s. So since then, Grażyna is all that we have. Her compositional output included mostly chamber music. She did dabble in orchestral and choral music, as well as incidental, or also known as movie music. But overall, just wonderful, wonderful composer who kind of mixes that neoclassical style and forms with the more dissonant harmonic language of the 20th century. So what's the justification for including this piece? This piece is actually supposed to be for a solo trombone to be accompanied by a trombone sextet. So it creates a collaborative opportunity for secondary school trombone ensembles to work with a soloist, right? And as of right now, there aren't a lot of pieces out there that do this. Adaptations that I had to make throughout this piece, I did have to alter the octave of the solo violin. Again, talking about what's idiomatic and accessible for the trombone versus violin. Violin in general just has a wider range, idiomatic range than the trombone does, so there was some voice changing there. And then occasionally, I transferred the part from the solo part to the second trombone part, just to give the soloist me a couple measures to breathe. I also expanded the pre-existing piano accompaniment to be trombone sextet, so instead of being these block chords on the piano, it's being performed by the full trombone ensemble. I again want to thank everybody for coming out today and supporting me on my doctoral lecture recital. And so this is the fourth movement, actually, of this Sonata da Camera, and this is the Andante Sostenuto.